back. It's time for the last two talks of the first day of North Bay Python. I hope you all enjoyed the afternoon break. Did we enjoy our milkshakes? Excellent. Mark will be back tomorrow with a completely different menu, which I'm similarly excited about. Our first speaker after the break is going to be talking to us about some cool new stuff that is happening in front-end web development. Please welcome Mario Munoz.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone. As you can see, that is my topic, Back to the Future of Hypermedia in Python. So let's see if I can pull it off without any ill-conceived references to on aging pop culture, such and whatever. Okay, this is the only one, I promised. All right, so I do like the term hypermedia. It sounds very retro, but also kind of futuristic. And that's perhaps because the term can actually still be both of those things. Retro in the sense that the terms hypermedia, hypertext, they were coined back in the early 60s by Ted Nelson. He had this vision of hypermedia that actually was not fully or entirely fulfilled with the advent of HTML. Now, the vision he had, and this is a little bit of the futuristic thing about hypermedia, is that now when we think of hypermedia in terms of HTML, you have a link to data somewhere in a server, and you have access to it. It's all kind of interconnected. But if that data moves from some server, now you have a dead link, and you have lost access to that information. In the original way it was formulated by Ted Nelson, there were two-way connections between information, not just outgoing links, but kind of interlinking connections between the data points. And he had a vision of preserving version control and rights management. Now, all of that wasn't fully realized. However, we have now our best representation of hypermedia, which is the World Wide Web. So yes, there's an aspect of the retro, which we talked about, but also a lot of things that we could realize even within the world of World Wide Web. Now I'm going to throw a couple of acronyms here that may or may not be important. Some of you know them really well. Some of them you may not be that familiar with. They're not super important, but I just kind of want to throw them out there. When you think of REST, usually you're thinking of APIs. It stands for Representational State Transfer. It's a response that is self-describing with some sort of uniform interface. Now, Roy Fielding, who was the creator of the term REST, he says that all application state transitions must be driven by client selection of server-provided choices. Now, that's a very wordy way of saying that this data should be self-preserving. You ask for it, you get it. There shouldn't be some intermediate state, and that's the ideal. One of those constraints is hypermedia as the engine of application state. The acronym here, I think it's HDMX is the way some people say it. I don't know. A constraint, that's one of these constraints. Now, there is an argument to be made that HTML itself is the best representation of a RESTful API. Now, a lot of you who are familiar with the term REST API, you might think immediately of JSON. Now, the point here is you can exchange information easily from the server, the HTML hypertext, directly to the user. We are kind of used to having this intermediary with JSON. Now, the problem here is, and many of you may have actually encountered this, is if you change the structure of your JSON, you also have to change the structure of your code. Whereas if you have your HTML as the engine of application state, your code stays correct. You just send the data correctly or straight to the user. So that's the impetus between these hypermedia-driven applications. You may have heard of multi-page app and MPA. Usually you're thinking of making a request, refreshing the entire content to the user. Every page, every click is a new page. That's a multi-page application, as opposed to loading all this data up to JSON and having a single page app where you have all that application state actually held within a front-end framework. So the hypermedia design is meant to kind of bridge those worlds, right, where you're not having to refresh a page every time the user makes a request. So there are a couple of hypermedia-driven frameworks out there. Hotwire is a popular one that's used in the Ruby, PHP space. But if you're into Python and you're kind of in the know, you've most likely heard of HDMX. Now, HDMX itself is a JavaScript library that allows you to control client requests directly from the server. This library was created by Carson Gross, and if you frequented the former Bird site, you may have run into one of his memes, one of many memes. They're great, so seek them out. They're also on his website, htmx.org. He gave a talk at DjangoCon US 2021, I believe. Even if you do not have an interest in Django, but have an interest in HDMX, I'd recommend watching it. Now, having a hypermedia design with HDMX now allows you to make server-side requests on any HTML element. So you have access to all the AJAX requests with the HTML verbs like get, post, put, patch, delete, outside of just hyperlinks or just forms. Now you can access these actions within any element in your HTML. And the best part is you yourself don't have to write any JavaScript at all. All your calls are embedded directly in your HTML, so you don't have to leave the comfort of Python and HTML. Now, I'm throwing this in here for now. Tailwind allows you to have access to styling conventions also within your HTML. You actually don't even have to open up a CSS file whatsoever. So you're cutting out a client-side rendering library for using JavaScript, making your HTML much more declarative. You know what it's doing just by looking at the HTML. And you can use TailwindCSS for a declarative design paradigm also within your HTML. It's kind of ugly, I'll admit. It's a lot of, it looks a little bit like inline CSS classes when you first look at it, and those we've been told those are evil. But you'll find that it allows for consistent design patterns, a lot of responsiveness, and it reduces maintainability with your CSS, infinitely, I would say. Now, how does it work? You're declaring classes within your HTML element, and I'll show an example of that a little later. And these predetermined classes then have a consistent design paradigm throughout your application. We'll see that in a little bit. But if you have the hypermedia-driven design, you have the design of your page or your application within your HTML, and you already know Python, then you can consider yourself a full-stack engineer. That's all you need, and it's pretty fantastic. All your server-side logic can be written in Python with your favorite backend framework. You can use Django or Flask, Fast API, whatever you're comfortable using. You're using some sort of template rendering engine like Jinja or Chameleon, something to that effect. Doesn't matter. You choose what you're comfortable with, and then all your hypermedia requests are handled within your HTML file as well as your design. And that's pretty great. So let's talk quickly about how HTML looks when it's embedded in your HTML. It might look a little something like this. Now, this is on htmx.org. It's one of the examples that's on the first page of the documentation. This is what it looks like. You have the button HTML element, and then you have these attributes that start with HX, so HX-post. What this is telling you is pretty simple. When a user clicks on this button, you see that through the HX trigger. When a user clicks on this button, it'll issue a post request to the clicked route, and the response that it gets from that route will actually be swapping the element in your HTML with an ID called parent-div. That's the ID of the element. So now you have control over which element in the DOM is getting replaced. The AJAX swap tells you how to swap it. You can either swap everything within those HTML tags or replace those HTML tags. You can include the content after a particular element or before it. There's different options of how you can insert HTML into your application. It's pretty great. So now you know that any element, not just anchors or forms, can issue HTTP requests, and any event that you hope for. Over here, we're defining the event as a click, but it could be a mouse over, it could even be a key press, and there's even modifiers for that. Like you can say the key press needs to be pressed for a particular amount of time, for example. For reactive search, for example, it can send a request every time someone types in something in a search bar and lifts their hands for a predetermined amount of time, and it'll bring up the response. Not any, or any HTTP verb can be used, not just get and post, but those are the most common. And what I think is pretty great is any element can be the target for an update from a request, not the entire window. So you're not refreshing every time a user is making a request. You might just be flipping the on and off switch on something, checked or unchecked, success, those kinds of things. That's kind of what HDMX looks like. And as you get working with HDMX, you'll start noticing some patterns. Now, these patterns and this is kind of what I want to say with this talk, is they're still kind of fluid because the way that it's being adopted in the Python space is kind of scattered. Some people are kind of going in one direction, other people are experimenting, but you start seeing some things that come up time and time again. And there are different resources that talk about these patterns. Perhaps the most important one, I'd say, is the one by Carson Gross called Hypermedia Systems. It is a book. You can buy it on Amazon or purchase an ebook, but he's made it freely available online. So if you just go to hypermedia.systems, the whole book is there, and it talks about all this from beginning to end. It's very, very descriptive and talks about the pros and cons. And I would recommend it as a way to, if you don't know anything about it, it's an easy entryway. Or if you kind of already have a sense of what you're doing, it's sectioned out really well so that you can go directly to what you need. Now, another really great resource, now it does look like it's Django focused, but I think even, again, if you're not that into Django, and who wouldn't be into Django, come on. Now, it is this library by Luke Plant. It's pretty great as well. It talks about some of the patterns that emerge when working with HDMX. And I won't be going into all of those because the information is out there already. But when you kind of start thinking about HDMX, there's two items that I think are really important to kind of wrap your head around that will help your design. The first of those is the concept of headers. Now, every time a user sends a request, a header is sent that your application can interact with. And that HTMX requests have specific headers that do specific things. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the second thing is this idea of partial content. I talked about how you're no longer replacing the entire page, you're replacing different elements. Now, instead of, again, you're getting data directly from the server. Hypermedia drives the application state, but sometimes you may just want to change something from green to red, and you can do that with your HTML, but you don't need to refresh the entire page. You just need to refresh that one element. Now, partials is one way that I've seen it written. Now, I prefer the term fragments. I think it's a little bit more descriptive, and it kind of follows the same language that I see Carson using. It's sometimes used interchangeably there too, but this can be confusing when you're first getting into it and trying to decide, wait, what's a partial, what's a fragment, what do we mean by that? But I'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so headers. Every time you send a request with HDMX, it populates different headers if they're available. It's always going to send an AJAX-request header element, and it's always going to be set to true. That way you can check within your code if the request was sent from an AJAX call within an element, or if it was a full page, someone going directly. The AJAX trigger and target are also very important. In your code, you can recognize what specific element is sending that request and what target it is meant to replace the response. You don't always have to use them, but they're there in your code, and you'll actually find yourself reaching for them more often as you get working with it. And AJAX current URL, sometimes you want to know where that request is coming from specifically, since you're not using an anchor tag or anything like that. This will tell you what URL the page is currently in. There's a few more. I think there's 8 or 9. I don't remember exactly, but these are some of the most common ones. So as you start working with HDMX, you get really used to using those and accessing those from the request. I also talked about fragments. So not the entire window has to be refreshed. You can target what element is going to be updated. Now, any element can be replaced. And I think this, I say it over and over, I think is what makes this really powerful. It makes the browsing experience a lot smoother for the individual. And like I said, if you're just wanting to change an entire menu item, you just say this menu, change it out when you click here. Or if you're wanting to replace a footer because of the page that someone has or an action that a user has made, you can do all those things. And the way to do that is that you would be rendering a fragment of a template fragment, basically. Instead of having an entire page that you're sending to the DOM, you can send a small snippet. And of course, that reduces the amount of data that's traveling through a network. So that'll increase speeds if you're thinking about that, especially if you have, let's say you have a large data set, hundreds of thousands of records you want to load for a user. Well, you're not going to want to load those all at the same time. So maybe you're going to do some pagination. So you're going to load maybe 10 of those records. What happens now is instead of preloading all that data into JSON and then displaying them with pagination, now you can use HDMX to request the first 5 elements, and you only get those snippets in your application. And as you cycle through, you're only getting a small amount of data. So you can actually handle a lot more data this way than you would otherwise with a quicker response time. Okay, so a pretty basic design is to have a request element that comes into your Python function, determining if it's an AJAX request or not, and then sending either a full page template or a partial template. So most of the time you're going to see, especially when you're starting out, you're going to see something that looks a little like this. Over here we have some page that we're getting a request from, and we're setting the template to the full content, whatever that page is. Maybe it's the landing page. However, if the request is an AJAX request, what we're doing then is we're setting the template to be the partial content HTML, which will just be a little snippet. And the response that we send back is going to have that request if it's needed in the response. And of course, the template will be equivalent to what you expect to send. So that's usually kind of what it looks like. And this is a pattern that's very common, and there are different ways to kind of maybe make this smaller or longer or more readable. I've seen decorators, for example, which kind of handle the the AJAX request in the background. There's a lot of different ways to approach this, but that's kind of where you're starting from. So tooling, what kind of tooling do we have to make HDMX easier? Now, one of the I think most accessible ones and easy to start using is middleware. Now, what middleware does is when a user sends a request, it kind of intercepts that request and does some stuff with it, and then it sends it to your application so that now you can use this additional stuff. And when you send this request back, it can put more stuff in that request. That's kind of what middleware does in a really janky way to explain it. Now there's Django-HDMX that adds that HDMX functionality to a request object, and that's what it is. It's basic middleware that is adding some of these expected keywords that correspond to those request elements. It makes them really accessible for you. On the non-Django side, there's ASGI-HTMX. It's pretty much the same as above, not Django specific, and it uses ASGI, so it would be maybe Fast API or those asynchronous applications. So these are some examples. There's other examples of other individuals who are using or trying to use middleware to deal with the request elements. But also, I talked about the importance of fragments. Now, there's an aspect of rendering fragments which Carson talks about, which is maybe rendering a partial part of a template, so you don't have to have all these smaller ones. You just somehow say, this block is what I want to render. There's Django renderblock, so you can render specific blocks of content from a Django template. You just have the curly braces with a block name, and it'll render just that content. And outside of Django, there's Jinja 2-fragments. You also render a block from within a Jinja template. There's helpers for routes and views, Jinja partials. I think Michael Kennedy wrote this one. You can reuse partial HTML templates in a pretty clever way. It's different than macros and that kind of stuff. You can read about it in one of his issues in that library, but it's very useful, especially when you're reusing a lot of, you're generating like, let's say, cards that kind of are reusing the same format, and you're kind of adding different data points. There's AJAX requests, which helps with view and URL management and other helpers as well. I think it also includes some middleware in there. And there's a newer one. I think Carlton has been working on Django template partials. Again, reusable named inline partials. How do you make things pretty? We use Tailwind. What I like about Tailwind is that you can have a responsive first approach. It makes it easy to define from the get-go. Like you just start designing with responsive elements, beginning with probably mobile first design, and makes it very simple to do that. I like its consistency. Once you're using those specific classes, your design looks very consistent from the get-go, which is pretty amazing, and it reduces bloat. Once you have a large CSS file, and then you need to change something, how many of you have gone to that CSS file and trying to find the class and where you defined it, and you're trying to change different elements? With Tailwind, you just define those classes in your HTML. Every time you save, you can have it rebuild, and you have a new CSS file without even having to touch it. So it's pretty great. If you're worried about code duplication because of the reuse of those inline styles, you're going to have partials and fragments and different abstractions that will make this pretty much a moot point in the end. It's actually easier to maintain in the long run. You can find that on the Tailwind website. And this is kind of what Tailwind looks like right here. Basically, you have a div element with a class bg-late-50 that just will convert to a background color element. Same thing with, let's say, text-3XL. It's going to create a font size that's predetermined to, like, I think 1.8 0.75 REM, like 30 pixels or so, and defines a line height for that. And then that's all you do. You declare that in your HTML. You save, it builds, it's in your CSS file. You don't have to touch it. If you thought, you know what, that didn't look big enough, so let me go to 4XL, you just change that to 4XL, you save, your font is bigger. That's all you have to do. You don't have to go and search for that class in some CSS file and change it there. So what's the point of all this? The point is you can work on your app much quicker than otherwise. Let's say you're bringing in a new developer and you kind of want them to have an idea of what's in the back end, but you also need them to help with the front end as well. You would love a full stack engineer, but do you have time to train someone on React or Angular or something like that? Now you can onboard someone much quicker, and the declarative style of the HTML allows for a quicker understanding, and all within the comfort of HTML and Python. So, takeaways. If you want to stick with what you know without compromise, HDMX, hypermedia design is definitely for you. You won't need to learn a front-end framework if you haven't already, and even if you have, you might be glad that you don't have to utilize it anymore. There are some case studies in the real world of people converting to hypermedia design, and it's going great. You don't need to come up with CSS class names. That's very important. And you can have consistent design, which I think once you're using templates and you're using partials and you're using the Tailwind classes, which are customizable, by the way, but even if you're just doing that, you'll get up and running a lot quicker. So resources, I just have one. If you want more information, you can go to PyHAT, which is awesome Python, HDMX. PyHAT is for Python, Hypermedia, ASGI Tailwind. I maintain that with someone else that's helping. All the information that I had here should be there, and a lot more. And feel free to join the discussion, and if you found a cool new tool, open a PR, let's get it added to the list, and hopefully we come to kind of a unified language and ideas on how to approach hypermedia-driven design within Python. Thank you all for being here today. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to chat with me afterwards. I'm on Mastodon at pythonbynight@fastodon.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario.